The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 10. Heinrich went straight to Rosrita and told her what he had heard. When he had finished, he gave her a look of awe. "Are you really from the future?" he asked. Rosrita frowned and shrugged. "It's no big deal. It's like meeting someone from Persia or Timbuktu." "Ah, I see. But you have to promise not to tell anyone. It's a secret." Heinrich promised, and Rosrita trusted him. But when she told him what she thought they ought to do, his eyes widened and he refused. He could get used to the idea of time-traveling visitors, but he wanted nothing to do with magic mirrors and hex wizards. Despite Rosrita's efforts, Heinrich resisted her suggestions. Then, on March 17th, Papa Weiss came into the house with a long face. "Now even the minister says we are no longer welcome. Because so many people think we have something to do with evil witchcraft, we will move," he muttered. "We cannot live where people hate us so badly. We will move to my brother's place in Harrisburg and try to sell the farm, so we can begin again elsewhere." And he set the date for moving for April 1st, the day on which Grandpa Drexel was fated to fall ill. The next days were frantic ones of packing. Mrs. Weiss alternately bawled at being forced to leave her home and rattled on, telling long stories about every stick of furniture. Heinrich grew weepy and talked about how much he would miss his fort, which was what he called Cottage Rock. Rosrita took advantage of this, telling Heinrich that his family might be able to stay if the two of them could just put her plan into action. Slowly, she won Heinrich over, and finally, in the twilight of the family's last day on the farm, he listened to her one more time. "You really think we could stay?" he asked in a hopeful voice. "Sure," Rosrita replied. "And if you can use the crazy mirror to find the treasure, too, your family wouldn't ever have to worry about moving again. They don't make rich people move off their land, no matter how weird they may act." "Yes, that's true," Heinrich said slowly. "I've been trying to figure out the code in the fracture writing just for that reason." "Sure," Rosrita said. "I've been trying too, but there has to be an easier way. So get that paper from your grandpa's book, and I'll get the mirror, and we'll give it a try." "But you're not a Bruja witch," Heinrich objected. Rosrita snorted. "Look, the mirror itself is magic, right? If it's magic, then you don't have to be magic to use it." Rosrita took a deep breath. She had one last card to play, and she was pretty sure it would work. Rosrita remembered how fascinated Heinrich had been on first seeing her beanie. She had kept it in a drawer since her arrival on the farm because she realized it would be hard to explain to people in 1828 what the little colored buttons meant. They were pins with cartoon characters enameled on them, and she had gotten them years ago from Kellogg's cereals, but none of the cartoons existed in 1828. "Look," she said to Heinrich, "if you get the paper, I'll give you that hat of mine that you liked." Heinrich's eyes grew thoughtful. Rosrita knew that they had a deal. About 20 minutes later, just about at sunset, Heinrich brought the paper to the barn, and Rosrita brought the mirror. It was easier than she had thought to sneak it out, because the whole house was in such a turmoil of packing and preparing. She hung the mirror on a nail, and Heinrich handed her the paper. She gave him the beanie in exchange, and with a proud smile, he tugged it onto his head. Rosrita felt a little stab of regret. That beanie was like an old friend of hers, but a bargain was a bargain, and besides, right now, the paper was far more important to her plans. Rosrita studied it. "We have to draw a circle," she said. "Then there are certain words I must chant. It says here that only those in the circle will be protected, so we'd better make it a large one." The barn had a stone floor, and the unused stall was clear of straw. Rosrita drew the circle using chalk. It was a lot like the one she had helped Grandpa Drexel draw, but there were differences too. This time it was a double circle with a 5-pointed star in the center of it. "We have to be sure a single point is to the east," Rosrita said, reading from the paper. "That way it will be a good symbol and not an evil one." "East is that way," Heinrich said, pointing. "The sun comes up right behind the tree on that side of the house." Then there were more outlandish words to print. Rosrita did these very carefully and checked them twice to make sure they were accurate. When everything was complete, Rosrita and Heinrich stood in the center of the star she had drawn. For a moment she hesitated, remembering the last time she had read from a book of magic. That time she had almost summoned a ravenous demon, but the thought made her more angry than scared, and more determined than ever to go through with her plan. In a firm voice she began to read the invocation on the paper that Heinrich had brought. Rosrita did not want to look at the mirror, so she kept her gaze on the paper. "Ach," said Heinrich in a hoarse whisper. "The mirror is flashing." Roswitha looked. The mirror was shimmering with a pale light blue glow. At first, she could see the two of them reflected in it, Heinrich's face looking over her left shoulder. Then a strange thing happened. The mirror went dark. It was like a TV screen being turned off. First there was an image, and then there was only blackness. But the weird light continued to flicker around the edge of the darkness. Then slowly another image began to form. It was a tall, skinny man standing behind something low, rounded, and white. The features were at first indistinct, but they gradually grew clearer. Heinrich stirred beside Roswitha, as if he were about to step out of the circle, but she felt the movement and pinched his arm hard. The man was holding something long and thin. He stooped over and started to work. Roswitha gasped. The man had a shovel, and he was digging. And the white thing in front of him was a gravestone. Carved on it was the name Diedrich Hoffmann, and the figures 1767 to 1828. Behind the man was a white church, its steeple ghostly against the darkening evening sky. Roswitha felt there was something awfully familiar about the scene and about the figure, but she could not recognize him because the man's face was averted as he dug into the hard, cold earth. Suddenly, the digging man stiffened. He turned and glared around him. "Stutzfuss!" Heinrich shrieked. The eyes blazed out at them, and Roswitha screamed. She had seen those eyes late on a cold night when the same bony figure had been out in the yard beneath the moon. Now they seemed to rip into her mind. The mirror flared one last time, and it fell dark. Roswitha's mind whirled. She felt as if her brain had been scrambled. "That was the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church," Heinrich whispered. "It's only a few miles from here." In the mirror, Roswitha could see only her own scared face and Heinrich's looking back from the glass. She took a deep breath. "I think we ought to go there," she said. "Yes," Heinrich said. His voice was strangely dreamy. "We can stop him from digging up the dead if we go now." Roswitha nodded. "Get the horse," she said. Heinrich saddled Nicholas, and both of them climbed up onto the animal's back. Roswitha could ride pretty well, but Heinrich was better, so she sat behind him. They clopped out into the twilight, and Heinrich kept the pace slow until they were well out of earshot. Then the horse walked faster. Roswitha felt her head buzzing oddly. She knew their only hope was to go to the graveyard and confront Stoltzfus and what? There ought to be something else, but she could not for the life of her think what it was. Oh well, it would come to her once they got there. It never occurred to her that an evil spell was luring them to the churchyard. It was a brisk night and gusty wind and blowing snow. Before long, they rode past fields crusted with glimmering ice, almost glowing in the darkness. Heinrich turned the horse right at a fork in the road. Minutes later, the church they had seen loomed into view, and they could dimly see a great ugly black hole in the snow covering the churchyard, the place where Stoltzfus had been digging. Nicholas stopped, whickering nervously. Roswitha slipped off, then Heinrich followed. Both of them walked toward the open grave. Roswitha swallowed. She remembered the terrible nightmare about the cemetery, where the skeletons had come clawing out of their graves. What if there were a corpse inside that hole, moldy and hollow-eyed and grinning? And what if two fleshless arms should shoot out and grab her? Nonsense, she told herself. Graves went deep, and this hole was barely started, because the pile of dirt beside it was small. In fact, a strong hand closed on her shoulder. "Ah!" a creaky voice said. "So I was right. Some little birds were spying on me, and here they both are. Turn around!" Roswitha's throat closed, and her jaw felt as if it were frozen shut. She could not scream, but her heart was pounding wildly. The voice carried an undeniable command, and it compelled her to turn around. Heinrich turned too. Old Stoltzfus stood over them, grinning in evil triumph. "You have saved me a great deal of work," he said. "Digging up a body is no joke when the ground is frozen, but fresh ingredients are always better. You will come with me." Roswitha turned to run away, but her legs were like lead. She heard the horse break into a gallop. Stoltzfus cursed aloud. "Fool that I am, I should have cast my spell to cover the beast as well as you two. No matter, no one will know where to look for you, and they will never find you." He noticed Roswitha twitching, and he laughed nastily. "Don't bother. I cast a strong enchantment over mine two spies. This time, it does much more than just silence you. You can move only when I tell you to. As long as I am not concentrating on any other magic, And now, both of you will get into my wagon and lie quietly while I take us to a place more suited to my purposes. And they did. Roswitha felt as though cold, invisible hands made her arms and legs move. She and Heinrich lay side by side in the back of the wagon with Stoltzfus's tall back towering before them, and the stinging snowflakes falling on their foreheads and cheeks. The wagon rumbled along for what seemed like an eternity to Roswitha. She had had nightmares before that were like this, when she wanted desperately to move but could not. She knew that something terrible was going to happen, and she hoped that the horse would find its way back to the house and that Mrs. Zimmerman could somehow guess where they had been taken. At last the wagon creaked to a halt, and once more the unseen hands forced her muscles to move. She, Heinrich, and Stoltzfus walked into the Stoltzfus farmhouse, down a long, gloomy corridor, and into the room decorated with hex symbols. A lone black candle burned on the big table in the center of the room. On the table were the black sword and the brass incense burner she had seen before, and 2 mirrors, one of them a twin to the one that still hung in the Weiss barn. Stoltzfus left Heinrich and Roswitha standing like statues while he went elsewhere. He returned in a few moments with a chair and a coil of rope. "Boy," he said, "you sit." Heinrich stiffly sat on the chair, and Stoltzfus bound him with the rope, hand and foot, so that he could hardly stir. "I will have to break this enchantment while I prepare for a greater one," Stoltzfus explained, "and I don't want you interfering with a mighty act of magic." He pulled a large turnip-shaped watch from his pocket and looked at it. "We have some time yet," he said. "These things have to be done just right or they won't work at all, and this particular charm will work only if it is completed on the last stroke of midnight." For a moment he looked at them both, grinning in fierce triumph. Then he said, "I believe I will keep the charm on you for a while longer. I owe you both a debt of revenge. You, my boy, are a member of the family that I most hate. And girl, your cleverness cost me a book of magic that is irreplaceable. It should have trapped and destroyed you, but somehow you knew the trick of reading backwards, and so you destroyed it instead. You spies want to know what I was doing? I will tell you, since you will never live to use the knowledge. You must know that a great treasure is buried in the Weiss farm. Well, the treasure is rightfully mine. Long ago, my father was a Hessian soldier serving the British in the Revolutionary War. His troop had the task of recovering traitors' gold from the town of Donnecker. 3 people stole it from my father's troop, and one of the thieves was Heinrich Weiss, this young villain's grandfather. Old Weiss succeeded in hiding the treasure, but my father caught him. So, my father had captured a thief who had stolen from the British crown. Did my father get a proper reward? Not at all. When the war ended, he went to prison, and there he brooded over the money that Heinrich Weiss had hidden, gold that should have been his. After he got out of prison, my father learned that Heinrich Weiss had died. He traced the Weiss family to this valley. Now he had captured Weiss, not far from this very spot, and he knew that the gold had to be nearby. So he brought my mother and me over from Germany, and we bought this farm, and we watched the Weiss family, hoping they would lead him to the treasure. Roswitha squirmed. Not so much, but she managed to wiggle her toes and fingers. Old Stoltzfus was getting all wrapped up in his wild story of treasure and revenge. She thought he might have a screw loose somewhere. The missing money might have belonged to the town of Donnecker or the American army, but any way she looked at it, the gold certainly did not belong to Stoltzfus's father. However, Stoltzfus obviously believed it did, and because of his anger and greed, his concentration was wandering from the spell that held them prisoner. She hoped that the charm would wear off, and that she could do, well, something. Maybe dive through the closed window and run away, or break the mirror, or grab the black sword that lay on the table. The angry Stoltzfus paced the floor on his spidery legs. His grating, high-pitched voice grew louder. "I always hated this backwoods place. By rights I should be rich, but the accursed Weiss family kept the treasure from my family. My father never learned where the gold lay. When he died, I found other ways to discover such things." He pointed at the table. "I studied hex magic. I found an old woman to teach me how to begin, and then I read books that she had never even heard of. I had to sell most of my wretched land to get the money to make those 2 mirrors. Then it took me years to discover how to summon and control the earth demon Azael. I am a clever man, my young spies. It takes cunning to deal with Azael. Rosrita thought she could walk again if she tried, but she didn't dare try yet, not with old Stoltzfus so close. If he would only start to pace again, she thought. Stoltzfus picked up and fondled the black-bound book. So on my side I have Azael, and my magic, and my wonderful mirrors, Heinrich burst out. Why didn't you use your old mirrors and let us alone? Stoltzfus started. So, he said, I have been inattentive, eh? Let me strengthen the charm. He put down the book and waved his bony fingers while chanting something. Rosrita felt her knees stiffening again. Darn Heinrich, anyway, he had to speak up just when she was about to make a break for it. After a moment, Stoltzfus said, Now you are quiet, eh? How you glare at me. You may hate me for what I am going to do, but I don't care. Your grandfather and father thwarted my family's chance for riches and respect, so I despise you. Foolish boy, you ask why? I did not use the mirrors. I did use them, but your farm is large. I have come there for 3 years now, once each month when the moon is right, but each night I can cover only a small bit of ground. I have found no treasure, and always I have had to flee like a thief if a dog barked or someone came out with a lantern. But if your family moved off the farm, then I could have all the time I need. Stoltzfus laughed. It is easy to convince people that a wicked sorcerer is burning schools and changing the weather, especially when a sorcerer is doing those things. The fools I turned against old Drexel never guessed that I was the magician, not your doddering old relative. Stoltzfus looked at his watch again. You could have left me alone, but you had to come spying. Your family could have moved months ago, but you stayed and stayed. Too bad for you. You see, I have borrowed money against my house and land, and on April 1st I must pay the mortgage on what remains of my poor farm or lose it. I am out of time, and so are you. The wizard lowered his voice, sounding nearly as frightened as Rosrita felt. I knew a dangerous magic spell to make Azael reveal the hiding place of treasure. I must use the larger mirror to open up a gateway to Azael's plane of existence, and I must put the question to him. His crooked, stained teeth showed in a wolfish grimace. Azael demands tribute for such information, human blood and hearts. I was digging up a dead body for him, but here you are. The first heart will be yours, girl, and the second one will be the boy's, I am sure. But Azael will appreciate a little extra sacrifice. Now I must prepare. The spell begins just before midnight. The terrible old man held his watch so that Heinrich and Rosrita could see its face. The 2 of you have not quite 3 hours to live. And that is the end of chapter 10.